This is the evolution of computers in my Gen X lifetime. My first exposure to computers was some of the early Apple Gen 2. I don't know if there's a 2E perhaps or not, but they were the big old boxes and we programmed very basic stuff in it. We would have a few lines of code. It was green on a black background and it was like turn right, turn left, and it was called Turtle Tracks, and you had a little turtle that would go and do whatever you programmed into it. We later used these same apples to play Oregon Trail and try to avoid dysentery. Somewhere in about the mid-80s, I was on a road trip with Dad over to Mason City, and we happened to be going through the electronics section of Kmart, and we saw a Commodore 64. And even though it was a demo model, which made it, say, probably around $100, it was a little cheaper than the new ones, but we bought that, and that was my first computer at home. What we didn't know is that the reason it was a little bit cheaper, not only was it a demo model, but the problem was that you would turn the computer on and after an hour it would shut off. It overheated. Looking back, I believe it was the power supply, which I figured out way later. Back then, we didn't have the internet to just hop on and go order a new power supply like I wanted. So I had to find an ad in the back of a magazine, power supplies for sale, and I sent them a check and I never received my power supply and got took for $60. The Commodore 64 was actually a pretty capable computer for that time. To me, much more so than the Apples that I'd been used to in school. With the Commodore, it had graphic features that they called sprites that were pretty smooth moving animations that you could do. It had decent sound capabilities at the time. The programming language was similar to BASIC, and I learned it by basically having Commodore magazines, reading programs, entering them into the computer, seeing what they did, learning how to tweak them, learning the syntax, and eventually I learned to program fairly well on it. In fact, I made one program that was a Rolodex, if you want to call it that. I had a sort of a index-looking card like this, and I had a letter up here for whatever the last name of the person was, and I had fields. I had name and address and phone number and notes and whatever else. And I put the family and friends' names and information that I had in there and made it searchable for all practical purposes and used the data files at the end to populate this. So it's something I was able to program in that was actually useful for me. The other thing I remember making specifically was a piano keyboard. So I programmed in the notes and I made a cardboard overlay that fit on the keyboard, and it basically mimicked the white and black keys of a piano. And for each of those keys that you would push, it would make a tone. Now, I didn't have it figured out how to make it to where if you'd hold the key down, the note would go longer. So they were just quick little quarter notes, but it was still something fun, and I was learning to program it pretty well for that age. After getting tired of the 1 hour limited time on it before cooldown was necessary and not getting my power supply, I finally bit the bullet and went and bought the Commodore 64C, which was the sleeker, thinner, it was more of a whiter cream color than the brown color of the old one. So it looked nicer and it performed better. Obviously this new one did because it no longer had a power supply issue. About the time I got the 64C, I also purchased GEOS, which was a graphical environment operating system. And it was, if you imagine your screen, GEOS sort of had this thing on it with these icons of different tools. And they sold a word processor and a spreadsheet tool and several others, GeoPublish, Geo whatever, GeoCalc I think was one of them. And it created this thing and some little icons down here maybe that was sort of a precursor and looks very much like an archaic version of what our Windows desktop looks like today. And again, that was called GEOS. So that was sort of an advancement at the time. The other thing that was a big advancement for us was the mouse. Now, I'd had an Atari 2600 that I used to play games with, and when I got the Commodore, it had an input for motion, so I used the Atari joystick. And the Atari joystick basically had 4 little connection points when you took it apart, and yes, I did take mine apart, and so you'd touch one of them, or you might go this way and touch both at once, and that was your joystick. First, they came out with a mouse that was effectively just a joystick, and then they came out with a true proportional mouse. And that was a pretty big deal as well to have this advanced mouse at that time. Now, neither the Commodore 64 nor the 64C were equipped with a disk drive built into the actual unit. So you had an external, and I think I bought a 1541C, which was the now newer white creamy colored one versus the old brown one. And I think I bought that when I still had the old Commodore before upgrading, but regardless, at some point I ended up with the 64C and the 1541C, and that took the 5¼ inch floppy drives. And we learned to do little tricks like paper punch the corner on the other side so that we could use it double-sided as a disc. At some point I kind of wanted to be able to print things, so I bought, I think it was an Octane 10 color printer, but it was pretty bad. It tried printing out the 3 colors, and you could see the gaps between the lines, and because it was quite a bit of money and it just wasn't performing well, I finally got tired of it, and I believe I returned that and got an Okadata Micro Line 184, I think it was, which was, I think they called it a tractor feed with a little nubs on the side and dot matrix. Pretty archaic, but at the time it allowed me to print out black and white documents as I wished. So I had the printing capability. It was much faster, of course, than the old color one. Still kind of noisy, but that really wasn't a concern. It was just about functionality at that time when it came to computing. You know, in high school, I did have a class in computer programming where we learned more about BASIC, which again, I kind of had a background from the Commodore, and we also learned Pascal, which is similar but different, I guess. The next computer I had at home was a Turbo PC 888 XT, and this was a hand-me-down from my uncle. So my uncle and the guy he worked with actually built computers, and they did some programming. In fact, they were responsible for the RUOK program used up in northern Iowa that they developed. And my uncle was on the police force, so what they did is they made this program using a phone utility called Watson. And that phone utility was used to dial up the elderly and just say, "Are you okay?" And as long as the person answered and then hung up, everything was cool. If for some reason the person didn't answer and didn't answer a second time when the machine tried again, then an emergency vehicle would be sent out to the residence, and it actually did save 1 or 2 lives of the elderly that had fallen and couldn't get up or whatever it was. So I believe they ended up on either the Today Show or Good Morning America show or something for this program they developed. Now that was all way beyond me. It was a hand-me-down device when I got it. However, it was still quite a step up from the Commodore. Just to compare pricing at this point, the original Commodore was around $100 as a demo unit. The 64C and I think the disk drive 1541C were about $150. I think the printer was about $180 or $90. And my uncle had paid about $2,300 for all the stuff to build this turbo computer that I now had back in the late 80s. So it was quite a bit more expensive. At that time, he was starting to leave his machine on all the time. And I asked him why, and he said because the most common thing at that time to fail was the power switch, because everybody's always turning them on and off, so they just let it go. It made sense to me as well because since I had Watson on the computer, I used that for an answering machine when I went off to college in the dorm. So had this fancy computer set up that I could barely use for anything functional, besides word processing, we did start doing reports on it. We could do documents. It wasn't quite as slick as what Word today is, but it was an early version. I think it was actually, might have been Word Perfect. I don't remember for sure, but we could do our documents, print it out right there, and the machine also worked as our answering machine. By the time I started engineering school at Iowa State in '92, PCs were becoming pretty common in the engineering labs. One of the first classes I had was Engineering 160 and Engineering 170, and I think 160 was around Fortran, which was kind of a dead language, and I think that was the last semester that was the only one offered. I think they went to C or C+ after that. But we learned to program a little bit more, and that was about the last real instructional class I had on programming computers. The 170 class used these same PCs for AutoCAD. And again, it was fairly archaic, but it had full 3D space. You didn't see a 3D model rotating around yet, but you had the 3D space, a P space and M space and all that information. So we had those. When I did my second internship in about 96 range or so, I noticed a huge difference in the computer lab from when I left to when I came back. The PCs now had a much brighter interface. They were much cleaner, faster, and we used those for different editing. We had some engine simulator programs. We also had Windows NT stations. That was the current operating system for the computers, and of course we like to do clever things like see which computer somebody else was on, and we could instant message that computer to say, your machine will be shutting down for a reboot, please save all your work, and then watch the person panic till they figured it out. Another big change was that we also had a couple rows of Sun Micro stations, which were way nicer machines, and people could check their email and do whatever else there, but we also at that time were getting licenses of Pro Engineer. So we could use those machines for that. In addition to Pro E, we also had things like Vericut that we would use for CNC programming to make sure that we did a dry run and that the tool wasn't going to bury itself into the metal or anything. So just a lot of changes, but we all had email at this point. We had access to the internet, yes. I think the first time we were on the internet was probably around 95 or so, and a buddy and I sat down and got on Netscape. No idea what we're doing, and I'd heard that it was real easy to get access to anything, and I thought, okay, let's just try Playboy. So the first thing I typed into Netscape was Playboy. Boom, there it comes up. And I thought, I see why people are concerned about this, but it's great for us right now as college kids. The last year of college was my next exposure to Apple since the Turtle Tracks and Oregon Trail dysentery of my youth, and it was for English class. The engineers all used PCs, which made sense for us, but the liberal arts folks liked their Macintoshes. So when we would take our technical writing class, we had to use the Macs. And they kind of looked like a Windows, except not as good. They had some sort of version of Word that wasn't quite as good, but we had to kind of fight through them. The worst thing about them was that by then we'd gone from the 5 1/4 discs to the 3 1/2 discs. And even though they were still called floppy disks, the shells were actually a hard plastic, not flimsy like the bigger ones. We all had these discs and we carried them around in our book bags, and that's what we used. We didn't have the cloud to store everything on. We had our little pile of discs and we had our resumes on it and our project files and whatever else. So we'd carry that around, and on a PC, when you put in the disk and you shut down your computer, you had a manual eject button and the disk came out and you were good to go. In the English department with the Macs, you couldn't do that. You would shut down the Mac, but there was no physical button to eject that disk. You had to wait for it to shut down, then restart the Mac, then go to the command on the screen that says eject your disk, then get it out, then shut it down. So again, another sour experience with Apples. In the work world, between my internships or co-ops and eventually my adult work that started in '98 after graduating college, for the most part, we had PCs. Most of these were engineering type related fields. So we had our PCs, most of them were desktops. Throughout the course of that, there was nothing really that jumped out as far as big advancements. We had our desktops. Eventually, laptops started to become more important and more common. For myself, I ended up having one just because I traveled so much for work. It made more sense to have a laptop instead of checking out one of the department ones that I had all my stuff on, just to be more efficient with travel. The next thing that really stands out in computer evolution to me was the netbook. And it was made by Dell, and I was traveling a lot for the job. This would be in about 2007, 8, let's call it, somewhere in there. And I had a big, old, heavy laptop that was kind of a pain to carry around. And I looked at what this Dell netbook that had come out, and everybody was making continuously bigger and faster memory processors. At some point you started seeing multi-core processors, and none of that made a huge difference for me. But the netbook was somebody that said, hey, we don't need all that power for everybody. So here's this cheaper, smaller, lighter netbook that you can carry around for travel. And it did really everything that I needed to. I wasn't doing big solid models and 3D AutoCAD or anything. When I had a big schedule, hundreds of line items, that started to get a little cumbersome to regenerate on the screen. But for the most part, it did what I needed to. It was probably half the price of our normal laptops. So that was a big deal, and that made travel a lot easier. Part of what drove the importance of laptops is not only were they more capable and competing with the desktops, but the desktops by this point were really kind of just used for people who did maybe FEA analysis or perhaps like solid modeling, whether it was SolidWorks or Pro E or something. But most of us, in fact, when I started my new job in 2010, everybody except the people doing the solid modeling had laptops. Now, it wasn't only easier to carry around for travel, but it was also easier to carry around for meetings. And that's pretty much what people did. We no longer went there with notebooks to a meeting, took notes, and then went back and transcribed it into our computers at our desk. We took the laptops with us, and we carried these laptops around from meeting to meeting with the tail of the mouse hanging down until they started coming out with wireless mice. And we carried these things like our trapper keepers when we were kids from one class to the next, and now it was just one meeting to the next. But from an efficiency standpoint, you could do everything right there on your computer, on your laptop, save it to the network or wherever it had to be, and you had access to it later. And that meant because you typed it instead of hand wrote it, you had it searchable, you had it, or you could organize it. And then we have things like OneNote and et cetera that would actually evolve after that to make it even easier. In my personal world, I slowly evolved from one desktop to another and just upgraded when I needed to. The first real big drive to get something new was because I started to record an album. And with all those music capabilities, with using Pro Tools, the ability to process all that sound and multiple tracks and everything, I needed a bigger, better computer. Everybody at the music store told me to just buy an Apple, but by this point, as an engineer, I was ingrained in PC droid world. So everything I had, my programs, my computers, everything was set up for PC, and I just couldn't see a point in changing that or having one machine different than the others. So I put together a PC that would do everything I needed, and it worked fine for the album. It worked really well, actually. The next big step for it came when I decided to make a movie and start to do more YouTubes. Because of that, the graphical requirements were much higher. When I bought the machine for the recording and the music, I'd chosen a cheaper graphics card because I didn't feel like I didn't do video games, so I didn't need a gamer graphics card. However, when you do a lot of videos, you need a graphics card that can keep up. So I again had to upgrade the system. Now cost-wise, by this time in comparison, these things are costing me about $4,000 for these high-level machines I had to have for doing each of those things. In terms of my personal laptops, I loved the netbook that I'd had at the one job that I mentioned a little bit ago, the Dell. So I later bought an HP netbook that I thought would be great for just a little travel laptop for when I went on, travel. I could take it with me to do this, that, and the other. But it was so underpowered. It was kind of at the bottom of the tier, like I mentioned the Dell had actually been, except the Dell seemed useful longer. The HP seemed like it was outdated about the time I got it home. It just wasn't useful. I wasn't using it as much to work on my books or whatever like I wanted. And so that quickly had to go by the wayside. The next purchase was in about July of 2015, and it was the Microsoft Surface Pro. And this machine was optional where you could spend $1,000 or $2,000. And I thought, I didn't use the HP netbook because it was outdated so fast. So I thought I'll go ahead and spend the $2,000 and get the nice one with all the capability and hope it lasts longer. And that really paid off because I had that thing from mid-15 all the way until about January of 22. So I got, about almost 7 years out of that thing, but worked great. It just started having some shortcomings towards the end. And so I thought before the heart surgery I was having at that time, I'm going to upgrade both the laptop and the phone. So I got the newest Microsoft Surface Pro at the time. And again, been happy with it ever since, works great. But again, I did go all the way to the $2,000 model or whatever and make sure I got something that's going to last a while again. The two scariest parts of the computer evolution in my lifetime are the connectivity and the dependence. From a work standpoint, about the turn of the century, if suddenly the internet was down, I could still go to my meetings, I could still type notes on the computer. Even if I didn't have the computer for some reason, I could still write them by hand, still had my notes. As long as the computers were working, I could still print locally if I needed to do something like that. I was still able to be productive. If I needed to travel, I still had my printed boarding pass. I still had cash that I could go jump in my car and drive wherever I needed to and pay for gas along the way. I could even send a check to the mortgage company in an envelope with a stamp on it, and I didn't need the internet to pay my bills. Try conducting business, travel, even your personal finances at home without the internet. It's not just the devices that we become so dependent on, but the internet. They're absolute necessities to get anything done, and they control everything from money to the military. And it's all interconnected somehow. Gen X watched the original Terminator, but scoffed at the concept that this Skynet or Cyberdyne systems could actually be all connected or all controlling. But we've cautiously watched that story unfold in front of us chapter by chapter in our lifetimes. Will the next generation be able to resist this appeal of tech advancement before it's too late and Skynet is self-aware? It's not looking good for us. It's pretty wild looking back over the decades. The evolution of computers that I've had in my time is one of the biggest leaps in consumer products that went from something that was sort of a luxury at one time to becoming what's a necessity in modern day life. If we take that old Commodore 64 I had and compare it with even this Surface Pro, which is already 2.5 years old, there are vast differences in everything from size and weight to memory to speed, graphics, overall capability, the connectivity this has. You've got the world at your fingertips with this. And who's been here to watch this entire computer evolution? That's right, us, Gen X. The generation that grew up on quotes like, "Now all I need is a computer and a 10-year-old kid to show me how to use it." Oh, followed closely in second place by that Nigerian prince that swears he's got a fortune to share with us. If you haven't done so, please click the link below to subscribe to the channel, click the little bell for notifications. If you don't, Skynet will probably do it for you soon anyway. And let's live for today.